10 2020 Democratic candidates held individual town halls last night on CNN. The topic was the climate crisis, and the recurring theme was taxing carbon dioxide. Many environmentalists and economists say a carbon tax is a good way to go, the effective way to cut emissions, but it's been met with political opposition. Before we bring in the panel, I want to play a little bit from last night's panel discussion.
We need to say that those who are throwing the carbon into the air that the rest of us have to breathe, that the rest of us have to deal with, are the ones who are responsible for paying for that.
If you are in the fossil fuel industry, you're going to be paying more in taxes, that's for sure.
I know you're not supposed to use the T word when you're in politics, but we might as well call this what it is. There is a harm being done, and in the same way that we have taxed cigarettes, we're going to have to tax carbon.
So let's bring in the panel, BBG Ventures' Nisha Dua and Dan Roberts, also joining us right now on set, former Congressman and 2020 Democratic presidential candidate John Delaney. Thank you all for being here. Congressman, let me start with you. When it comes to health care, something you certainly know, you've said your candidate colleagues know nothing about health care. What about the environment and the proposals for carbon taxes? What do you say about that?
Well, I actually introduced the only bipartisan carbon tax bill in the entire Congress a few years ago. And I think a carbon tax way is the way forward in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, because it fundamentally makes fossil fuels more expensive. And in a market-based economy, which we have, it discourages their use and it makes other forms of renewables more competitive. But the key is, what do you do with the money? In my proposal, we collect all the money, we put it into a lockbox, and we give every American a dividend. So in many ways, it goes out one pocket in the form of higher energy prices, and then it goes back in the other in the form of a dividend. And for your average American, their dividend will be greater than the amount of increase in their energy cost. Unless you do it that way, I think a carbon tax is a non-starter. You have to return the money to the American people, because you can't go to hardworking Americans, 40% of them who can't pay their basic necessities, their utilities, their housing, their food, and say we're going to dramatically increase your energy costs, and we, the government, are going to keep the money and use it for other things. You've got to give it back to the American people in the form of a dividend. That's the right policy. It's also the right politics.
Then how do you pay for some of the other environmental measures that presumably you would want to enact?
You got to find other ways to pay for them. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do to find ways of paying for things. But I think as it relates to a carbon tax, which under my proposal raises $3 trillion over 10 years, because if you're going to discourage CO2 emissions, you really do have to make fossil fuels much more expensive. You just got to give that money back to the American people. You really do at the end of the day. Or you're just going to increase energy prices on hardworking Americans. Because look what happened in France, right? The president put a price on carbon, and he used the money to cut taxes and do other kind of government programs. And what did the French people do?
Yellow vests.
They reached into their trunks, they put on those yellow vests, and they protested. Jay Inslee, the governor of Washington, who's been a great leader on climate change, he governs a state that's very progressive. He's tried to pass a carbon tax bill multiple times where the revenues would go to the government and they'd spend them on green energy projects. The kind of things I support, but most Americans say, listen, I don't trust you spending this money. You've got to give it back to the American people.
Yeah, Congressman, as you say, for most people, a carbon tax is going to be a non-starter, and it's unlikely that any kind of these proposals will really see the light of day. Now, similarly, if we zoom out, it kind of looks like even the environment and all these issues has been a non-starter in the campaigns. I mean, yes, we hear some people talking about it. You mentioned Jay Inslee. That was his numero uno issue. Didn't quite work out for him in his candidacy. So when you look at sort of the top issues in the campaign as we head into 2020, and we know how President Trump feels about the environment and about climate change, yes. What more should we be saying about this? What kind of focus might we see? Or is it going to remain something that a lot of people realize, it's something we should care about. Right. When it comes down to brass tacks and who ends up being the candidate, it's not going to be a number one, number two, or even number three issue.
Yeah, but I do think we also have to talk about innovation. Right? Because if the United States actually wants to solve this problem, not only for our own country, but around the world, we actually have to start inventing new things. We need new battery technologies. We need new transmission technologies. And I believe we need to scale up things called negative emissions technologies, which are actually machines that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. They exist. The technologies are provable. They're just not of scale. We would have said the same thing about wind and solar 20, 30 years ago. We created a market for them. The private sector innovated, and it created technologies that now work. I think we have to do the same thing with negative emissions.
But so you have let's call it's like a 6-point plan to reduce carbon emissions. And I think everyone seems to be presenting this plan to get to carbon neutral by 2050. So what proportion of that plan relies on the tax versus being able to be driven by these other initiatives like the negative emissions technology?
I think the putting a price on carbon, when you combine it with continuing the renewable credits, can get the entire electric grid, if you will, to net zero. The problem is we don't have offsets for airplanes, for big ships, for agriculture, and for manufacturing. That's where we're going to need new innovation, and that's where we're going to need negative emissions. So if you think about the amount of energy, the amount of carbon that's produced from that stuff, it's about 30%. The rest from the electric grid. So that's how I would think about it.
Why would an American voter buy into a Democratic proposal on carbon emissions when two of the largest CO2 emitting coal burning plants in this country are going to close down by the end of this year? And the Chinese have said they're still going to be burning the worst kind of CO2 emitting coal to power their expansions. So
that's why you can't, as I say, solve it on the backs of workers. Right? So if you put a carbon tax in place, which I think could happen, because again, I introduced it with bipartisan support, you got to take the money and give it back to the American people. The American people will be fine with that. But then we actually have to bet on innovation, right? Which is in many ways our greatest strength as a nation. So we should think about ourselves as having an obligation to solve this problem from a technological standpoint. And by the way, we will then own the most valuable technologies in the world. Because ultimately, I think the whole world is going to have to deal with it. So if the United States of America is the leader in battery, transmission, and negative emissions technologies, not only will we save the world, but I think we'll build a huge industry in our country. I mean, I've called for the creation of something called a carbon throughway, which is effectively a pipeline in the middle of the country that is laid in existing natural gas right-of-ways, right? So we get to build a pipeline, create a whole bunch of jobs. And then if we create this whole industry around direct air capture, it'll be located in the heartland where we need jobs, because if you actually capture CO2, you're going to have to transport it to some place where it can be used productively. So I think there's millions of jobs to be created if we get this right.
So this is what you would have said last night.
Yes.
But you weren't there last night. I'm curious, because your campaign, as I understand it, is largely self-funded. You're a wealthy man. How much have you spent? How much more are you willing to spend to keep this campaign going? It's
not entirely self-funded,
right,
but it is largely self-funded. So I've spent about $7 or $8 million, and then I've raised, $3 million. So that's what.
And how much further are you willing to go? Because there's one more debate that you could qualify for. Do you think you're going to qualify for it? I mean,
we're working on it. Listen, my plan is to absolutely stay in this race through the early states. And my wife and I are committed to make sure that we stay in the race. So I'm willing to do what I need.
Well, you're going through Iowa. I mean, you've said publicly it's
absolutely
all about Iowa. So what
it totally is all about Iowa.
If you get in the top third,
yes.
If you manage that, why does it change for you?
Well, look, I think these elections are very much like the market, right? There are expectations, and if you exceed them, you get a huge amount of momentum, and if you come up short, it goes the other way. So for me, finishing the top third in Iowa is very successful, and I think people will start focusing on the fact that someone like myself, who has real solutions, not impossible promises, has a real vision for the future, is what the party needs. And that's the bet I'm making.
If you look at the latest numbers, and you look at who I think perhaps represents another moderate sort of the front runner, many would say, who is Joe Biden. But if you combine Sanders and Warren's support, percentage-wise, they now exceed that of Biden, which suggests that there is appetite for socialism or a more leftist candidate or candidates. So how do you sort of square that with the more moderate positions that you are putting forward?
Well, look, I think it's still early. There's no question there's an appetite for what Senator Warren and Senator Sanders are putting forth. I think it's the wrong way forward, not just as a matter of policy, which I definitely think it is, but I think as a matter of politics. If we want to beat Donald Trump, which I think is the absolute #1 priority, I don't think anything even comes close to that, we need someone who can win independents. Because Trump's going to turn out his voters, Democrats are going to turn out, the race is going to be fought in the center. I think the top 3 candidates right now all have very significant vulnerabilities. And I think that's very risky, not only for the Democratic Party, but for the country. And we need a real debate to make sure other viewpoints are considered.
We look forward to when you come back, because we want to continue the discussion and ask you about those vulnerabilities for those top three. But we have to say thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Representative John Delaney, Democratic presidential candidate, former congressman from Maryland.